Hi everybody, and thanks for actually showing up to listen to me ramble on for half an hour. I'm Tina, and I co-run Brain and Nerd, which is a small indie studio that started here in 2012. We released our first title finally after so many bumps in the road this year, and we're now working on a second title, a pile of prototypes. And we're sort of in those conversations with publishers and things like that, and things have really stepped up for us. We won a few awards for our first game and things like that, so we've definitely had a good few successes, but not without several bumps along the way. And this whole sort of aim of what I want to cover today is ways that you can avoid some of those bumps that we've already sort of taken, so you guys don't need to take them too if you go into game development. I could probably list like 100 different ways in which we made, small mistakes that ended up having, real cost to our development time and things. But today I'm going to keep it vaguely contained and talk about 20. So the very first thing I wanted to cover is how you manage community as a game dev. When we launched Predestination, to get our startup capital, we went straight on Kickstarter back when Kickstarter was still new and shiny and people very much supported it. We went on Kickstarter with a very early prototype of Predestination. It looked nothing like it does today, was very, very different, more simplistic and more idealistic in a lot of ways. We added those man hours, however, of having to manage that community straight at our prototyping stage. We didn't really factor that. We didn't think it would take as much of our time after Kickstarter, ongoing throughout development, as it ended up doing. And then those hours had to come out of our development time. So straight from, prototyping stage, we were having to manage that community. I would say don't do that. If you're going for it yourself, because you don't get that second chance at making a first impression, and it also does detract from the amount of time that you can spend doing what you do best. So timescales is another thing that eluded us for the longest time. So you would think that the first 90% of the work that you sort of plan out at the beginning will take 90% of your dev time. That sounds logical. It's not. So what happens is you get further and further along in your project, and your milestones and definitions and everything else become clearer as you go along. It's the same for anything that you would program. But you need to sort of buffer that in right from the very beginning, because you'll have other parties who are tied onto your time frame that you give. So you need to ensure that those buffers are sort of always in your head. Every time that you're given a quote for something, you're planning something on a Trello board, whatever sort of tools you want to use. Once you've done your buffer, add more. So I would say whatever you think is a logical buffer, go and double it. And then you should get a more accurate roadmap by the end. So one of the unique things and challenging things about being a game developer is that you're also sort of managing a lot of the business side of things. Even if you go the most simplistic self-publishing route, like we did with Predestination, for instance, there's still so much you need to do to build your credibility and manage your company, so that you do get the traction that you sort of need to get to place your game on a market. And that's true whether you go PC gaming through Steam, where you don't need to do too much in the way of like licensing or credentialing, or even on consoles or phones, mobiles. You have to think of what you do as a business first, because ignoring some of that early groundwork, setting up your company identity, your ethos, your goals, things like your business plan, it makes your life so much harder down the line. So it's very, very easy to sort of overpromise when you're a new game dev, especially when you're naive to timeframes and the reality of building some of the features that you talk about. We certainly fell into this pit. So we ran our first crowdfunding campaign in 2012. We entered early access on Steam with our game in 2015. Predestination only released this year. It was a long, long road for a tiny, tiny team. And that largely is to do with a lot of the promises that we made right back at the beginning in 2012 that we then had to be sure that we delivered for those customers who bought in so early and supported us throughout that whole development window. Now, I gotta say, our early audience, the crowdfunding audience, they're probably the most generous and forgiving audience that you could ever find for a game, but that's not so true when you go to other platforms, so it's definitely something to bear in mind. So, while I'm talking about that, early access is not a test ground. So, the name early access makes you think that you can pop up your alpha or beta build of your game, get some, great feedback from active players who are interested in the concept, and iterate on that. Not so much. Those people on Steam are people like you and I who are active customers who, they want an active product that is well supported, is well delivered, is bug-free and polished, even if they're buying in early access. And excuses don't wash. So you have to be sure you don't ruin your splash and dilute your reviews on Steam by launching into early access before you have that fully functional beta. It should be absolutely feature complete, and the only thing that you should need to do is like some extra content things and a little bit of polish. It shouldn't be the case where you're still working on features or using those people as your QA, which just won't wash at all. So yeah. The QA cost in games is something that's not only worth it, it's required. As a dev, you're far too close to your project to assess its quality with any sort of accuracy. It's your baby, you love it, you've worked on it for years, and you just think it's amazing, even if it's, maybe not totally polished. You're, liable to make excuses for it and everything else. You need to use that QA not just for, that accuracy and quality check, but also you have to go and pass an approval process for your consoles, like Xbox and PlayStation, that will require you to prove that you've actually done enough QA groundwork. So if you aren't going to invest in a reputable QA team to go and do that for you, you need to be sure that you can attract a publisher who will. One thing that we love to do as developers is reinvent the wheel, because then we think we've made a better wheel. It's not the case. It's just not the case. Only roll your own tech when it's absolutely necessary, Brandon. My developer's right there in the front row. So what we did for Predestination is we made our own engine, and we went through a lot to do so. We made our own tools and things like that we probably could have found elsewhere easier. So now we would say absolutely don't do that. If there's a viable solution already, use it, adapt it, make it your own. So now you have that many different choices for game engines and things like that you shouldn't find too much of an issue there. Your main issue is going to be actually making a choice. Honestly, it doesn't really matter which you pick, so long as you pick it and commit and learn it and know it and absolutely exploit it to the best of your ability. We now use Unity, but there are totally other alternatives that are just as effective, really. Always remember that you're a cost to your project. So we, as an indie team, tend to do a lot of work without valuing the amount of time it's going to take us to complete it, and without necessarily thinking of that as a production cost. Especially when you're sort of in that pre-funding stage, you don't feel like you deserve to be paid, or like that you don't earn that cost, so to speak. But it's something that you should pay attention to right from the off, because it'll save you in the long run. So if a tool saves you 10 hours of your time, it is worth paying as much as those 10 hours would cost, and maybe even a little bit more, because it could save you more time down the line as well as you get further down into development. So don't be afraid to put some spend in at the start to save later on. No, and done is done. This is something that I think everyone who makes their own project start to finish will struggle with somewhere along the line, be it knowing when you have enough to have an alpha that you can actually release to people, whether it's, you know, being able to push that big scary release button, wherever the case might be, you'll sort of struggle with whenever you can call something done. Iteration is amazing, necessary. It's absolutely key to creating a game that is playable by the end, but you have to know when to stop, and that comes down to your processes. You need to set yourself a termination point, whether that is, you know, 2 passes, 3 passes, or a certain quality check is up to you. But once you set it, stick to it. Stick to it. And don't be afraid to abandon a feature or come back to it later on if it's still not slick after that final pass. Don't keep fighting with it, you waste so much time. One thing that we sort of didn't take on board at first that we now very much do is that some ideas just won't work in a game. They can sound great on paper, they could sound great in your head, they could even play well in a separate sort of game medium. So you might have a mechanic that is glorious for a card game but just doesn't translate into that sort of digital space, and that's okay. But be aware that those ideas may not work, and don't be afraid to change the rules a little bit to make your project work, rather than stand true to that initial vision and sort of derailing your whole project. So we have a great example. Predestination blends the sort of planetary stuff of Civilization with the out in space kind of stuff from Master of Orion 2. Our planetary gameplay we iterated on 3 times because it just wasn't working, and it now is absolutely nothing like the first idea that we had on paper. Unique isn't always a positive. As game developers, we think that making something that is entirely unique and totally alien to a player could be a really, really cool thing. Most of the time it's not. We find that now when we're looking at an idea, we'll cement it in something that our player knows and responds well to already. We'll do our market research and be sure that that's the case. And then we'll add 1 or 2 little brain and nerd twists on top. And then that's what makes an idea that is ours, but still something that will have a good uptake with the community. And publishers, more importantly, really, really appreciate that. So when we were at our publisher meetings for our new game that we're working on, Hertelius, we were able to say that it's like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids meets Subnautica. We tethered it into something that they know. And then on top of that, we were able to show them, you know, little videos and screenshots of the unique mechanics that are truly ours. And that came over really, really well for them. So yeah, always make your deadlines internal, not public. We were very naive when we started. Brent was fresh out of university and I only had some, you know, vague middle management experience and not in anything digital. So our release dates and timeframes, we thought we could keep them. We had them, you know, sort of locked down even as early as our Kickstarter campaigns. Oh, sweet summer child, that was a bad idea. I would urge nobody who is in the sort of prototyping stage to even consider putting a release date on anything. Really, truly, if I were to do it myself, I would go right through till at least alpha, if not beta, before I would even consider putting a release date on it. Now, when you're talking to people like publishers, you'll want to put a quarter on it at least, so that there's a vague time frame, but you don't want to get too specific. It just sets tiny teams up for failure. When we started in Predestination, we had no concept of pipelines or project management. It was all very new to us, and it was something that we had to learn quite quickly. And you know, we've had failures along the way in that sort of process, that learning process. So we focused on get it done, just finish that thing, get it done, be doing something, instead of taking the time regularly to plan, and more importantly, take the time regularly to revisit a plan. It's all very well setting up, you know, a nice sort of development plan, If you don't use it, it's going to fall by the wayside. You need to keep yourself accountable to said plan. And we didn't do enough of that throughout predestination. It's definitely a lesson that we've learned going forward. You need to adopt the right workflow in each of your processes early, and that needs to be led by the people who are using the workflows, not just the people at the top of the chain, to be sure that they're actually going to work and it's the most efficient way you can do things. So I've already spoken a little bit about buffers. One thing to note is that costs need buffers too. When you're planning a project and you're seeking funding, don't undervalue your work just to keep a low budget. We certainly did that with predestination. So we thought that we could totally finish predestination on $25,000 back in 2012. Oh gee, predestinations cost somewhere around 150,000. So yeah, we were very, very, very wrong in our sort of appraisal there. And why we were wrong is because we didn't value each of the jobs that would happen aside from the programming side, which is, you know, so much more than what the programming amounted to be. Publishers and the public alike won't trust your tiny budget anyway. It's actually been one of the things that's come up in feedback from things like grants, from publishers and things like that, that our budgets are too low to be viable, and so they don't want to back. So that's something that we fixed. Many hats make light work when you're on a tiny indie team like ours. Everyone on the indie team must be multidisciplinary in some sort of way. And that includes directors, and that includes rockstar programmers. So you could be the most gifted programmer, you know, to ever step foot in an indie studio. If you can't wear another hat and adapt to the challenges of an indie studio, it's not going to work. I went back to uni to become more technical because, you know, I was doing the sort of project management bit, keeping us sort of accountable as much as I could. And I just needed to learn more. And so I did that to make that happen for our team. Brendan does a lot of our financial side. Each of our artists will do 2D and 3D. Some will do videos and animation, it depends. But everyone wears more than one hat. Okay, there's a big difficulty when it comes to easy tasks. So just because a task won't technically challenge you, or just because, you know, it's not going to take you more than a week to do, doesn't mean you don't factor it in your overall timeline, because those little jobs really add up. Things like doing a final pass, things like filling out that wee bit of paperwork to submit something, it all adds up and it eats your time, especially if you're a tiny, tiny team like ours. Those tasks definitely caused the biggest disparity in our timeline when we go and look back at the predestination workflow. They were more accountable for how off we were with our time frame than any of the big tasks. We could predict them much more accurately than the small tasks. So do give them credit. So the coastline paradox is real. We, as developers, to timeline and manage a project, will break it down into these neat little units. We'll measure their approximate weight in terms of man hours, and then we'll just assign a time commitment to them, and we'll just put them in a row, and that's that done, right? Well, thing is, when you go and look deeper into each of those tasks, you can discover that there's a lot more complexity to each individual task than what you ever envisioned at first. So you have to account for that by always looking back on those time estimates that you give and seeing if there's a trend in your predictions where you're consistently off in one area. So for us, we tend to be far more off when it comes to art than we do when it comes to general programming tasks. We've kind of got that down, but our art pipeline has definitely caused us some big oversights when it comes to timing things accurately that we're addressing even now. So, are we really game devs or are we game R&D? Game development, just by its very nature, is just continual R&D. you need to think about innovation and experimentation all the time. When you start a project like we did in 2012 and don't release it until now, tech changes so much in that time frame. Where does our game sit in the market now? How relevant is it now? Is it as polished and pretty as it could be? Maybe not. You kind of have to factor in where you're going to go in the future, and you have to think about how you're going to react to those changes during the development pipeline without going into derailing the whole thing. You have to factor sort of research and development failures into your pipeline as well, and have backup plans. So if you're iterating on something or making it more innovative than what the baseline feature would be, know what that baseline feature does so that you can fall back on it if worst does come to worst. So one project for a studio to be working on at any one time is not a viable model in 2019. You can't just work on one game anymore if you're going for sort of, a very sustainable growth model for your studio. The reality of the indie scene now is that you're going to face a great degree of skepticism from audiences because of things like crowdfunding skepticism, how bloated the market is, the abuse of early access, things like that. So you need to have backup plans. So you always need to think of a plan B, C, D, and hopefully even further. So for us, if we're developing a business plan, we'll talk about the main thing that we're developing, which is Fertilius. Then we'll talk about our slate of prototypes. And then we'll talk about maybe being able to do work for other studios within the pixel mill where we're based. We'll talk about all these backup things that we can do to keep viable as a studio, even if we don't get the publishing deals that we're looking for. Just always remember that you're running a business now. As great as it is to spend so much time developing something that you truly, truly love, you have to always look at your business and what the products and services you're offering are, and factor that into your 5-year plan. So one game isn't going to take you, all your bread and butter for 5 years unless you're very, very lucky. You need to have a slate of smaller releases that will help chime you, over in that time, and hopefully help build you into bigger and bigger projects as you go. You always need to have the answer for everyone else of what's going to come next for you. And that's pretty much where I wrap up.